The late autumn wind swept through downtown Manhattan, carrying with it the sharp bite of approaching winter. Glass towers stretched toward a pewter sky, their reflective surfaces catching the dying light of another corporate day. From the 42nd floor of Miller Technologies, CEO John Miller emerged into the marble lobby, his charcoal suit impeccable despite the weight of another grueling board meeting pressing on his shoulders. His hand found the small, warm fingers of his 7-year-old daughter Emma, who bounced beside him with the irrepressible energy that only children possess. Her school uniform was still pristine, her backpack covered in colorful patches that seemed to glow against the sterile corporate environment surrounding them. "Daddy, can we get hot chocolate before we go home?" Emma's voice echoed softly in the vast lobby, her breath visible in small puffs as they approached the revolving doors. John's mind was elsewhere, still calculating the quarterly projections and the merger details that would dominate his evening. But as they stepped onto the sidewalk, Emma suddenly stopped walking. Her small hand tugged at his with surprising strength, pulling him toward the stone steps of the adjacent building. "Daddy, look," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that made John's attention snap into focus. There, huddled against the cold granite steps, sat a young woman with tangled auburn hair and clothes that had seen too many seasons. Her thin frame was wrapped in a faded denim jacket, holes visible at the elbows. But it was what she held that made John's breath catch in his throat. Cradled against her chest was an infant, no more than 10 months old, whose weak cries pierced the urban noise around them. The baby's lips had taken on a bluish tint, and his small body trembled with cold and hunger. The mother bent her head down, whispering soft reassurances while gently rocking back and forth, her own eyes hollow with exhaustion and something that looked dangerously close to defeat. "Daddy." Emma's voice was barely audible now, they looked so hungry. John Miller had built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had negotiated with world leaders, commanded boardrooms, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But standing there on that windswept corner, watching his daughter's face contort with concern for strangers, he felt something crack open inside his chest that he had kept carefully sealed for 3 years. Ever since the cancer had taken Margaret away, leaving him to raise Emma alone while running a company that demanded everything he had left to give. John Miller's story had not always been one of solitary success. 5 years earlier, he had been a different man entirely, one who came home to the sound of laughter echoing through the halls of their Westchester estate. Margaret had been the kind of woman who could make a corporate dinner feel like a family gathering, who remembered the names of every employee's children, and who never let John forget that beneath his expensive suits beat the heart of the small-town boy from Ohio who had worked construction summers to pay for business school. Emma was Margaret's gift to the world, a perfect blend of her mother's compassion and her father's determination. At 7, she possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that often startled adults. She could sense when the doorman at their building was having a difficult day, and she never failed to offer him one of the cookies from her lunchbox. She noticed when Mrs. Patterson from the apartment downstairs seemed lonely, and she would convince John to invite her to their occasional Sunday dinners. But Margaret's death had changed everything. The house felt too large, too quiet, too full of memories that cut like glass. John had thrown himself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, building Miller Technologies into one of the most innovative firms in the city. Success had become his armor, and Emma had become his only remaining source of light in a world that had grown significantly darker. Now, standing before this young mother and her crying child, John felt the weight of his daughter's expectation. Emma's hand had not released his, and he could feel her small body trembling with the effort of restraining herself from running directly to the strangers on the steps. The woman looked up then, perhaps sensing their presence. Her eyes met John's for just a moment, and he saw in them a pride that refused to be broken despite her circumstances. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably in her mid-20s, with the kind of bone structure that suggested she had once been considered beautiful. Now, exhaustion and worry had carved premature lines around her eyes, and her skin had the pallor of someone who had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. Sarah Thompson had not always lived on the streets of New York. 18 months ago, she had been a secretary at a small law firm in Queens, proud of her tiny apartment and her growing savings account. She had dreams then, plans for the future that included the man she loved and the child they had created together. But pregnancy had cost her the job when her morning sickness became too disruptive. The man she trusted had disappeared when the reality of fatherhood became too overwhelming for his 24-year-old sensibilities. And the eviction notice had arrived just 3 weeks after little Michael had taken his first breath. The shelter system had been a nightmare of bureaucracy and danger. She had lasted exactly 5 nights before deciding that the streets, cold and uncertain as they were safer for her baby than the overcrowded facilities where violence was as common as hunger. For months, she had managed to find work cleaning offices late at night, leaving Michael with a woman who ran an informal daycare out of her car. But when the woman moved away, and Sarah could not find another solution, the delicate balance of her survival had collapsed entirely. Now, as she looked up at the well-dressed man and his daughter, Sarah felt the familiar surge of shame that had become her constant companion. She had learned to avoid eye contact with people like this. People whose clothes cost more than she had seen in months. People who belonged to the world she had once been part of. But the little girl's face held no judgment, only a concern so pure and immediate that it took Sarah's breath away. "Please, Mommy," the child was saying to her father, though her eyes never left Sarah and Michael. "Can we help them?" John felt the corporate executive in him calculating risks and considering the dozens of reasons why getting involved would be complicated. There were procedures for this sort of thing, organizations specifically designed to handle homelessness, professionals who understood the complexities of poverty in ways that he certainly did not. Getting personally involved could create dependencies, false hopes, or simply prove to be inadequate to address the deeper systemic issues at play. But Emma's hand in his was warm and insistent, and when he looked down at her face, he saw Margaret looking back at him. His wife had possessed the same ability to see straight through to the heart of what mattered, cutting through all the rational arguments to arrive at the simple truth underneath. The baby's cries were growing weaker, and John realized with a start that this was not merely about discomfort or general hunger. This was about a child who was genuinely in danger, whose small body was losing the fight against cold and malnourishment. The mother's obvious exhaustion suggested that she had been struggling with this situation for far longer than any person should have to endure. "Emma," John said quietly. "Wait here for just a moment." He approached the steps slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, recognizing that dignity was likely all this young woman had left to protect. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he crouched down to her level. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in board meetings or conference calls. "My daughter and I were wondering if you might join us for some dinner. There's a restaurant just around the corner that's warm and quiet." Sarah's instinct was to refuse. Pride had kept her alive when everything else had failed, and accepting charity from strangers felt like a betrayal of the woman she had once been. But Michael's cries had taken on a desperate quality that cut through every other consideration. She had not eaten in 36 hours, and her milk had begun to dry up. Her baby was starving, and her pride was not worth his life. "I don't have money to pay you back," she said, her voice hoarse from days of sleeping outdoors. "That's not what I'm asking for," John replied. Behind him, Emma had moved closer, and her presence seemed to soften the entire exchange. "My daughter has a good instinct about these things. We'd consider it a favor if you'd let us buy you both some food." Sarah looked at Emma then, really looked at her, and saw in the child's face the same kind of unwavering compassion that she had once believed in before the world had taught her to be more cautious. The little girl smiled at her, a smile so genuine and uncomplicated that Sarah felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. "Okay," she whispered, struggling to her feet while keeping Michael secure in her arms. "Okay, yes, thank you." The restaurant John chose was a small Italian place 3 blocks away, the kind of family establishment where the warmth hit you the moment you walked through the door. The hostess looked uncertain when she saw Sarah's appearance, but John's presence and quiet confidence smoothed the way to a corner booth where they could sit without drawing attention. Emma slid into the booth across from Sarah and immediately began making soft cooing sounds at Michael, who had stopped crying the moment they entered the warm restaurant. The baby's eyes, a startling blue against his pale skin, focused on Emma's face with the kind of intensity that very young children reserve for things that genuinely interest them. "He likes you," Sarah said, and Emma beamed with pride. "What's his name?" Emma asked, reaching out one finger for Michael to grasp. "Michael," Sarah replied, then added, "I'm Sarah. I'm Emma, and this is my daddy, John." Emma's introduction was formal in the way that children are when they're trying to be grown up. "Daddy, can Michael have some of my milk?" John found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "I think Michael needs a different kind of milk than you're thinking about, sweetheart. But we can certainly make sure he gets what he needs." The server approached their table, and John ordered without consulting the menu, choosing dishes that would be both nourishing and easy to digest for someone who had not eaten regularly. Sarah watched this process with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, still not quite believing that this was really happening. When the food arrived, Sarah's hands shook slightly as she picked up her fork. The simple act of eating warm food while sitting at a real table felt almost foreign after months of surviving on whatever she could find. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her body reminded her of how depleted she had become. But even as she ate, Sarah continued to cradle Michael, and it was Emma who noticed that the baby was still fussing despite the warmth of the restaurant. "Is he still hungry?" Emma asked with concern. Sarah nodded, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I haven't been eating enough to feed him properly. The admission hung in the air between them, a stark acknowledgement of just how desperate their situation had become. John felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this was no longer about a simple meal or a moment of charity. This was about a mother and child whose survival was hanging by the thinnest of threads. There's a pharmacy next door, John said quietly. They'll have formula and bottles. Whatever he needs. Sarah looked up at him then, and John saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. Why are you doing this? It was Emma who answered, her 7-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Because Michael is hungry, and you're his mommy, and mommy should never have to watch their babies cry like that. John felt his throat tighten. Margaret would have been proud of the woman their daughter was becoming. Would have recognized her own values reflected in Emma's simple, unshakable conviction that helping others was not a choice but an obligation. 20 minutes later, they watched as Sarah fed Michael from a bottle of formula, the baby's eager sucking, creating the only sound in their small corner of the restaurant. Sarah cried silently as she fed him, tears of relief and gratitude and something that might have been hope streaming down her face. Emma reached across the table and patted Sarah's free hand gently. It's okay, she said in the voice she used when comforting her stuffed animals after bad dreams. Michael's not hungry anymore. And as John watched his daughter comfort a stranger, as he saw the color return to the baby's cheeks and witnessed the first real smile cross Sarah's face, he began to understand that this encounter was changing something fundamental in all of their lives. The walls he had built around himself and Emma, the careful distance he maintained from anything that might make him vulnerable again, were crumbling in the face of his daughter's enormous heart and this young mother's courage. The question was no longer whether they would help Sarah and Michael survive the night. The question was what would happen next, and whether John was brave enough to follow his daughter's lead into territory that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. In the days that followed, John found himself thinking about Sarah and Michael constantly. He would be sitting in strategy meetings, listening to reports about market projections and competitive analyses, when suddenly, his mind would drift to the image of that young mother trying to comfort her crying child on the cold stone steps. The contrast between his climate-controlled office and her desperate situation felt increasingly absurd. Emma, with the persistence that only children possess, asked about them every day. "Daddy, where are Sarah and Michael sleeping tonight?" she would say as he tucked her into her warm bed in their spacious apartment. "Are they still cold?" John had given Sarah his business card and $200 in cash before they parted that first evening, telling her to call if she needed anything. But the phone remained silent, and John began to understand that pride could be both a survival mechanism and a trap. It was Emma who finally forced his hand. On Thursday evening, as they walked through the same downtown area where they had first encountered Sarah, Emma stopped walking and announced with the kind of certainty that brooked no argument, "We need to find them, Daddy." They found Sarah and Michael in a small park 6 blocks away, huddled together on a bench under a streetlight. Michael was wrapped in a blanket that John recognized as one he had purchased along with the formula 3 days earlier, but Sarah's lips were blue with cold, and her body was shaking uncontrollably. "This is insane," John said, though he was talking more to himself than to Emma. "You can't live like this. Neither of you can survive another week of this weather." Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held both defiance and desperation. "I've been taking care of us just fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're dying," John replied bluntly. "And Michael will die with you if you keep this up." The words hung between them like a challenge, and John realized that he had reached a decision point that would define not just Sarah and Michael's future, but his own as well. He could walk away, knowing that he had done his part by providing a meal and some temporary assistance. He could return to his comfortable life and his demanding career, perhaps making a donation to a homeless shelter to ease his conscience. Or he could do something that felt both completely reasonable and utterly terrifying. He could treat this young woman and her child like human beings whose lives mattered as much as his own. "I have an apartment," John heard himself saying. "A small place that the company keeps for visiting executives. It's furnished, it's warm, and it's empty most of the time. You and Michael could stay there." Sarah stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "I can't pay rent," she said slowly. "I'm not asking you to pay rent," John replied. "I'm asking you to let my daughter and me help you get back on your feet." Emma, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, suddenly stepped forward and took Sarah's free hand. "Please," she said simply. "Michael needs a warm place to sleep." And Sarah, looking down at this extraordinary child who seemed to understand things that adults had forgotten, felt the last of her resistance crumble. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, yes." The apartment was small but elegant, located in a renovated brownstone in a quiet neighborhood that felt like a different world from the streets where Sarah had been surviving. It had one bedroom, a compact kitchen, and a living room with large windows that let in actual sunlight. To Sarah, it felt like a palace. John and Emma helped them settle in, and John found himself studying Sarah's reactions to simple things like hot running water and a refrigerator that hummed with electricity. She moved through the space carefully, as if afraid that touching too much might make it all disappear. "There's a grocery store 2 blocks away," John explained, handing her a credit card with her name on it. "Use this for whatever you and Michael need. And there's a pediatrician's office across the street if you want to have him checked out." Sarah held the credit card as if it might explode. "I don't understand why you're doing this." John glanced at Emma, who was sitting on the floor making faces at Michael, who had begun to laugh for the first time since they had known him. "Because my daughter is 7 years old, and she's already a better person than I am. And because I think you deserve a chance to be the mother you want to be." That night, as John and Emma returned to their own apartment, Emma was quieter than usual. As John tucked her into bed, she looked up at him with an expression that seemed far too serious for someone her age. "Daddy," she said carefully, "are we going to be their family now?" The question caught John off guard, partly because of its directness, and partly because he had been wondering the same thing himself. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, are we going to take care of them the way families take care of each other?" Emma's voice was small but determined. "Because I think Michael needs us. And I think Sarah does too." John sat on the edge of her bed, trying to find words for feelings he did not fully understand yet. "I think," he said slowly, "that we're going to help them for as long as they need help. And we're going to see what happens from there." Emma considered this for a moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "Good," she said. "Because I already love Michael. And I think Sarah is brave, like Mommy was." The comparison to Margaret hit John like a physical blow, but not an unpleasant one. Margaret would have done exactly what Emma was suggesting. She would have opened their home and their hearts without hesitation, and she would have trusted that love was always the right choice, even when it felt risky. "Yes," John said, kissing Emma's forehead. "I think Mommy would have liked Sarah very much." Within a week, a routine had established itself that surprised John with its naturalness. He would stop by the apartment every morning before work, ostensibly to check on practical matters but really to see how Sarah and Michael were adjusting. Sarah had taken Michael to the pediatrician, who confirmed that while the baby was underweight and had been mildly malnourished, he was fundamentally healthy and would recover quickly with proper nutrition and care. Sarah herself was transforming in ways that were both subtle and profound. The hollow look had left her eyes, replaced by something that looked cautiously hopeful. She had gained weight, and her hair had regained its natural shine. More importantly, she had begun to smile, and when she did, John could see glimpses of the confident young woman she had been before life had knocked her down. It was during one of these morning visits that Sarah asked the question John had been expecting. "What happens next?" she said, bouncing Michael gently while he played with a toy that Emma had brought him. "I can't live in your apartment forever." John had been thinking about this constantly, and he had an answer that surprised even him. "Actually," he said, "I was hoping you might consider working for Miller Technologies. We have an opening for a receptionist position, and it comes with health insurance and childcare assistance." Sarah looked at him skeptically. "You're offering me a job out of pity." "I'm offering you a job because you're smart, you're articulate, and you handle pressure better than most people I know," John replied. "The fact that you've managed to keep yourself and Michael alive under impossible circumstances tells me everything I need to know about your competence." "I don't have recent references," Sarah said, but John could hear the hope creeping into her voice. "You have me," John replied. "And I'm the one who does the hiring." The job offer represented more than employment to Sarah. It represented the possibility of rebuilding a life that had dignity and purpose, of providing for Michael through her own efforts, rather than depending on charity, no matter how kindly offered. But more than that, it represented John's faith in her as a person rather than simply as an object of sympathy. "Yes," she said, and her smile was radiant. "Yes, I would like that very much." Emma, who had been listening to this conversation while playing with Michael, clapped her hands together with delight. "This means we'll see you every day," she announced with satisfaction. And John, watching his daughter's joy, and Sarah's tentative happiness, began to understand that what had started as an act of charity was becoming something far more complex and meaningful. They were becoming, in Emma's simple phrase, a family of choice, bound together not by blood or law but by the recognition that they needed each other in ways that none of them had expected. The first day of Sarah's employment at Miller Technologies was a study in contrasts and small victories. She arrived at the gleaming headquarters building, wearing a simple black dress that John had helped her select, her hair pulled back in a professional style that somehow managed to make her look both competent and approachable. Michael spent the day at the company's childcare facility, a benefit that Sarah had never dreamed of accessing. The reception desk was located in the main lobby, a position that required Sarah to interact with everyone from delivery personnel to visiting executives. She approached each interaction with a combination of natural grace and fierce determination, as if she were silently proving to herself and everyone around her that she belonged in this environment. John found excuses to walk through the lobby multiple times that first day, ostensibly checking on other matters but really observing how Sarah handled herself. He watched her calmly manage a minor crisis when the building's computer system temporarily crashed, redirecting calls manually and keeping visitors informed with a professionalism that impressed even the senior partners. "She's good," observed Janet Morrison, the office manager who had initially been skeptical about John's unusual hiring decision. "She has that rare combination of efficiency and warmth that makes people feel welcomed." But not everyone was immediately accepting of Sarah's presence. There were whispers, carefully modulated conversations that stopped when Sarah entered a room, raised eyebrows that suggested some people found John's involvement in her life inappropriate or naive. Sarah was acutely aware of this undercurrent of judgment, and it took all of her newly rebuilt confidence to hold her head high and focus on doing her job well. The real test came 3 weeks into her employment, during the company's annual client appreciation event. Miller Technologies had rented the ballroom at one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels, and all employees were expected to attend. Sarah had been dreading the event, knowing that her background would be even more obvious in such an elegant setting. She needn't have worried about fitting in socially. John and Emma had become her advocates and allies, and their obvious affection for her had begun to influence other people's perceptions. But there was one person at the party who seemed determined to make Sarah feel unwelcome. Robert Whitman was a senior vice president whose family wealth predated his professional success by several generations. He had never liked John's tendency to make decisions based on what he called emotional impulses rather than pure business logic, and he viewed Sarah's employment as a perfect example of his boss's poor judgment. The confrontation happened near the hors d'oeuvres table, where Sarah was standing with Michael, who was dressed in a tiny suit that made him look like a miniature businessman. Whitman approached them with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "So, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to attract the attention of nearby guests, "John tells me you're working out well in reception. It must be quite an adjustment from your previous lifestyle." Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. "Every job is an adjustment, Mr. Whitman. I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the company's success." Of course, Whitman continued, his tone becoming more patronizing. "Although I have to wonder how our clients feel about being greeted by someone with your particular background. Image is so important in our business, you understand." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, not because they were untrue but because they voiced every fear she had about her own worthiness. She felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack, and she wondered if she should simply excuse herself before the situation became worse. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the ambient party noise with startling clarity. "Mr. Whitman," John said, approaching their small group with Emma at his side, "I couldn't help but overhear your concern about our company's image." Whitman turned toward his boss with the confident smile of someone who believed he had been making a reasonable point. "John, I was just discussing with Sarah the importance of maintaining professional standards." "Professional standards," John repeated, his voice deceptively calm. "You mean like treating colleagues with respect? Like recognizing talent and competence regardless of personal history? Like understanding that our company's image is actually enhanced when we demonstrate genuine compassion?" The conversation had attracted the attention of other party guests, and Whitman seemed to realize that he had miscalculated badly. "I simply meant that." "You meant to humiliate a member of our team," John interrupted, his voice gaining strength and volume. "You meant to suggest that Sarah's value as a person and as an employee is somehow diminished by the fact that she faced difficult circumstances before joining our company." John moved to stand beside Sarah, and Emma, with the fearless instinct of childhood, stepped forward to take Sarah's free hand. "Let me be clear about something," John continued, addressing not just Whitman but the entire group of assembled guests. "Sarah Thompson is one of the most competent, dedicated employees this company has ever had. She handles pressure with grace, treats everyone with kindness, and brings a perspective to our work that makes us all better at what we do." He paused, looking directly at Whitman with an expression that left no doubt about his feelings. "She also happens to be an extraordinary mother who has overcome obstacles that would have broken most people." If you find her presence here threatening or inappropriate, that says nothing about her character and everything about yours." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than humiliation. Emma squeezed her hand and looked up at her with a smile that suggested she had never doubted for a moment that her father would do exactly what he had just done. Whitman mumbled something that might have been an apology and retreated quickly toward the bar. The other guests began to disperse, but not before several of them approached Sarah to introduce themselves properly and express their pleasure at having her as part of the team. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to John, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank me by never again doubting that you belong exactly where you are," John replied, and Sarah realized that somewhere in the process of defending her, he had moved closer to her than strictly necessary. Emma, observing this development with the keen awareness that children possess for adult emotions, smiled to herself and began making faces at Michael, who gurgled with delight at the attention. The weeks following the party marked a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between John and Sarah. What had begun as an act of charity and evolved into a professional relationship was becoming something more complex and emotionally charged. They began spending more time together outside of work. Initially for practical reasons related to childcare arrangements, but increasingly simply because they enjoyed each other's company. Emma served as both catalyst and chaperone for these developing feelings, insisting that Sarah and Michael join them for weekend activities like trips to the zoo or lazy Sunday brunches. During these outings, John found himself studying Sarah's face when she laughed. Noting the way she instinctively reached out to steady Michael when he wobbled while learning to walk, admiring her ability to find joy in simple pleasures after everything she had endured. Sarah, for her part, was amazed by John's patience with both children, his willingness to get down on the floor to play with building blocks, his gentle way of teaching Emma new things without making her feel inadequate when she struggled. She had never known a man who was so completely comfortable with the demands of fatherhood, so willing to prioritize his child's needs over his own convenience. But both of them were cautious about acknowledging what was happening between them. John carried the weight of his grief for Margaret and his fear of risking his heart again. Sarah struggled with questions about her own worthiness, wondering if her feelings for John were genuine attraction or simply gratitude for everything he had done for her and Michael. It was Michael who finally forced the issue, in the way that only a one-year-old can. During one of their Sunday afternoon visits to Central Park, he took his first independent steps, walking shakily but determinedly from Sarah's arms toward John, who was kneeling on the grass several feet away with his arms outstretched. "He's walking." Emma shrieked with delight, jumping up and down as Michael tottered between the two adults. "Michael is walking." John caught the little boy as he tumbled forward, scooping him up and spinning him around while Michael giggled with pure joy. Sarah watched this scene with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the realization that her son had taken his first steps toward the man who had become the most important person in both of their lives. When John looked up and saw her crying, he set Michael down gently and moved toward her with concern. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Everything's perfect. Too perfect. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for this all to disappear." John reached out and touched her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear she had missed. "It's not going to disappear," he said quietly. "This is real, Sarah. All of it." And then, with Emma cheering and Michael clapping his hands, John kissed Sarah in the middle of Central Park on a sunny Sunday afternoon, and Sarah finally understood that fairy tales could happen to ordinary people who had been brave enough to believe in second chances. The engagement ring was modest by the standards of John's wealth, but it was perfect in every other way. He had chosen a simple solitaire setting that seemed to capture light from every angle, and he presented it to Sarah during a quiet dinner at the same Italian restaurant where they had shared their first meal together almost 6 months earlier. Emma had been John's co-conspirator in planning the proposal, helping him select the ring and choose the restaurant, practicing his speech with the seriousness of someone who understood that this moment would determine her family's future. She sat at the table across from Sarah and Michael, barely able to contain her excitement as John cleared his throat and began to speak. "Sarah," John said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion, "6 months ago, my daughter taught me something that I had forgotten. She reminded me that the most important moments in life happen when we stop planning and start listening to our hearts." Sarah set down her fork, her eyes already filling with tears as she began to understand what was happening. "You and Michael have changed our lives in ways that I never could have imagined," John continued, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You've brought laughter back into our home, you've given Emma a brother to love, and you've reminded me that families can be built on love and choice, rather than just biology." He slipped from his chair to kneel beside the table, producing the ring box with hands that trembled slightly. Emma bounced in her seat, whispering, say yes, under her breath. Sarah Thompson, John said, his voice growing stronger. Will you marry me? Will you let Emma and me be your family for real and forever? Sarah looked around the table at the faces that had become her entire world. John with his kind eyes and patient heart, Emma with her enormous capacity for love, Michael with his innocent trust that these people would always keep him safe. 6 months earlier, she had been sleeping on the streets with no hope for the future. Now she was being offered everything she had ever dreamed of, and several things she had never dared to imagine. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, absolutely yes. John slipped the ring onto her finger while Emma applauded and Michael banged his spoon against his high chair in celebration. Other diners began to notice the commotion and soon the entire restaurant was applauding, but Sarah was aware only of the weight of the ring on her finger and the feeling of John's arms around her as he stood and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the garden of John's Westchester estate on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. Sarah wore a simple ivory dress that Emma had helped her choose, and Michael served as ring-bearer, toddling down the short aisle with the rings tied to his wrist, while the small gathering of family and friends laughed and cried simultaneously. Emma was the maid of honor, a role she took very seriously, and she delivered a speech during the reception that brought everyone to tears. My daddy was sad for a long time after my mommy died, she said, her 7-year-old voice carrying clearly in the garden air. But then we found Sarah and Michael, and now we're happy again. My mommy would like Sarah very much, because Sarah takes good care of all of us. John stood to respond, and his voice was thick with emotion as he addressed their small gathering. Margaret used to say that love multiplies rather than divides, he said, looking out at the faces of the people who mattered most to them. She meant that opening your heart to more people doesn't make your love smaller, it makes it bigger. Today, I understand what she meant. He turned to look at Sarah, who was holding Michael while Emma leaned against her side. Sarah, you and Michael didn't replace anything we had lost. You added to everything we had left. You made our family bigger and stronger and more joyful than I ever imagined it could be. As the afternoon wore on and their small wedding party celebrated in the garden, John and Sarah found themselves standing apart from the group for a moment, watching Emma teach Michael how to chase butterflies among the flowers. I have an idea, Sarah said, her voice soft but determined. Something I've been thinking about for weeks. John turned to look at her, noting the particular expression she wore when she was working through something important. I want to start a foundation, she continued, for single mothers who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. Job training, temporary housing, childcare assistance, all the things that might have made the difference for me if they had been available. John considered this for a moment, then smiled. The Margaret and Michael Foundation, he suggested. Named for the woman who taught us to love without limits, and the little boy who reminded us that every child deserves a chance. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You would do that? We would do that, John corrected. Together. As a family. And as they watched their children play in the garden of their new home, surrounded by people who loved them and committed to work that would honor both their past struggles and their current blessings, John and Sarah understood that they had found something more valuable than security or comfort or even happiness. They had found purpose, and they had found it together. The foundation began small, operating out of a converted warehouse in Queens with a staff of 3 and a budget that was ambitious but manageable. Sarah threw herself into the work with the passion of someone who understood exactly what they were trying to accomplish, while John provided the business expertise that turned good intentions into effective programs. Within 2 years, they had helped 47 women and 63 children transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment. Each success story felt personal to Sarah, because she remembered the desperation and hopelessness that these women carried when they first arrived. She remembered what it felt like to believe that she was worthless, that her mistakes had disqualified her from happiness, that her child would suffer because of her failures. But more than the professional satisfaction, Sarah treasured the family life she and John had built together. Emma had become Michael's fierce protector and favorite playmate, and Michael adored his big sister with the uncomplicated devotion that only very young children possess. The 4 of them had developed their own traditions and inside jokes, their own ways of celebrating small victories and comforting each other through disappointments. John had learned to be happy again, not in the desperate way of someone trying to forget loss, but in the full and complicated way of someone who understood that life could be both tragic and beautiful, often simultaneously. He had discovered that love did not require him to forget Margaret or love her less. Instead, his growing love for Sarah seemed to honor his first wife's memory, by proving that the capacity for deep feeling she had awakened in him had not died with her. On Michael's 2nd birthday, they threw a party in the same garden where they had been married. and John found himself standing in almost the exact spot where he had promised to love Sarah forever. Michael was toddling around the yard in a party hat that was too big for his head, while Emma organized a complex game that seemed to involve equal parts tag and treasure hunting. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Sarah asked, coming to stand beside him. "When Emma saw us on those steps?" John slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. "Every day," he said. "I think about how close we came to walking past. How different our lives would be if Emma hadn't stopped to look." Sarah leaned into his embrace, watching their children play in the afternoon sunshine. "She saved us," she said simply. A 7-year-old girl looked at two strangers and decided that love was more important than convenience. "She learned that from her mother," John replied. "And she's teaching it to all of us every day." As if she had sensed that she was being discussed, Emma looked up from her game and waved at them, her face bright with the kind of uncomplicated joy that makes adults remember why life is worth living. Michael, seeing his sister wave, raised his own small hand in imitation, even though he wasn't entirely sure what he was waving at. And John and Sarah waved back, surrounded by family and friends in the garden of their home, understanding finally that some stories don't end but simply continue, chapter after chapter, built on the foundation of that first moment when someone decides to care about a stranger's pain as much as their own comfort. The true measure of their success would not be found in bank accounts or business achievements or even in the number of families their foundation helped, though all of those things mattered. The true measure would be found in moments like this one, when two children who might never have met were laughing together in a garden, when two adults who had given up on happiness were planning a future together, when a family that had been broken was whole again in ways that none of them had thought possible. "Daddy! Sarah!" Emma called from across the yard. "Come play with us." And hand in hand, they walked toward their children, toward the future they had built one small act of kindness at a time, toward the life that had begun the moment a little girl named Emma had tugged on her father's hand and said, "Daddy, they look so hungry." Behind them, the afternoon light slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the garden where a family of choice had learned that love, like light, grows stronger when it's shared.